I want choices and rights. Choices and rights. Choices and rights.
It started for me about a year after I came out of hospital in 1987. And I saw something about an organisation called Survivors Speak Out. I mean, it was a big deal for me to go out, actually, rather than just go to a meeting.
Yeah.
So I went to this, I think it was like an annual general meeting. It was a big meeting in London. And for me, and it's something that sticks in my mind a lot, it was like a breath of fresh air. It was like something very different. And when I've thought about it, and when I've said about it, it really was like being able to be yourself with other people, which is something that, especially when you've been having some particularly difficult times, and in relation to what we call mental health issues in our society, is not a common experience. And so I went to that, had a lovely feeling, had some conversations with people, and then began to get involved bit by bit. That's how it started for me. My kind of medical history is as someone who was identified as having depression and anxiety. I was then prescribed tranquilizers, which were incredibly destructive, and the reason why I, as part of a group of people, were in hospital was to get off those tranquilizers. So my experience of hospital was actually a really positive one. You know, I've been through the gamut of different kinds of NHS responses to mental distress. The one I haven't experienced is being sectioned. Although lots of people I know have had those experiences. My experience has been complex. It was a shortish time in hospital, but a long time in direct contact with services. Essentially, it was making contact with people who were very like, you know, they were human beings. You didn't have to disguise who you were. You could be honest about it. And what I learned, of course, is that it's like everything. All survivors aren't the same. Some things I found really difficult, other people found a breeze, and vice versa. But I got to know people, and then I can't remember the process. Then I got involved in going to meetings, and then eventually becoming part of a committee. And what was really important about Survivors Speak Out was that I think it was an organisation that we could compare with organisations like those of the emerging disabled people's movement in the UK. To start with, there were people who were not service users involved in the committee, but that changed with some difficulty, so that we really became a survivor-controlled organisation, and we weren't, you know, there was a set of principles, and these were principles which were very much counter to the way in which, certainly then, and I would suggest now, people with mental health issues, as is generally talked about, are understood or responded to. But there wasn't a simplistic rejection of a medical model. There wasn't a rejection of the medical model, but there was an understanding of social relations. There was a real significance attached to us being people, full people, having rights as people, and also that we had understandings which were important, that our expertise had something to it, that we understood ourselves, that we could work out what might be helpful responses to our difficulties. So I think what was so exciting, and in some senses you could say things have in some ways gone backwards since, was this determination to speak for ourselves instead of being spoken for by traditional charities, and to have a real say in understanding what was happening to us and trying to do something about it together. One of the lessons I have learned in my life, which you know, is decades now of being involved in campaigning, is that there are different ways of making change, and mostly we think about making change in terms of trying to influence the formal processes, the formal policy, and the formal politics, you know, through parliamentary activity and the rest of it. I think user-controlled organisations are critical in that, in bringing us together and helping us to rethink what's happened to or happening to us. As for us bringing about change in the things that we pressed for, I think you could say our success, other people's success since, has been very, very qualified. I am amazed sometimes about two things. One, the incredible capacity capacity of the psychiatric system to resist and, as it were, to suborn change. You know, it takes it over and makes it into its own image. That's one thing. And also our continuing difficulties to get any kind of equality in terms of our organisations and what we have to say, any kind of equality in credibility, resourcing, recognition of our actual authority. One of the things that we became aware of was the need to address issues of diversity, because I think it's almost a process that counter-organisations go through, that they start off perhaps as being a kind of a vanguard, and the vanguard reflects the broader constraints and exclusions of vanguards. Something that I would want to highlight, looking back and trying to look back accurately, is just how much of an emphasis there was across major political parties on the threat, risk and danger that mental health service users posed. There was the terrible tragedy of the murder of a man called Zito during, I think, the 90s. And I can remember, identified as, quote, the key election issue before the 97 election at which New Labour was elected. I think it was The Sun that ran stories about what are you going to do about the threat from mentally ill people. And I know that the Shadow Health Minister for Labour was as firm in what she had to say about the importance of protecting the public from the threat, danger and risk of mental health service users as any other political party. We have to remember that was very, very important at the time. And there would be a conversation about the public which polarised it against service users, as though service users all posed a threat and were not part of the public. And it should be remembered that, and it was evidenced at the time, that many of those very sad occasions when highly visible violence was committed and could be associated with a mental health service user was traced to be related to the lack of support received by that mental health service user, frequently with them trying to get support because they realised that things were going wrong for them. I know that the major academic research showed no significant change in the rate of violence and mortality following on from decarceration policies. But essentially what those policies worked out to be, and I think it was different for some people with learning difficulties, where I think some significant support and resourcing were put into it when they had the opportunity to leave former mental handicap hospitals. But basically for people as mental health service users, we are talking often about people being placed, instead of being in large institutions, in unwanted, isolated bedsits, in unwanted tower blocks, in inner city areas which were devalued and without resources. And I think a number of people had a very tough time in and out as a result of supposedly progressive policies because of the unfortunately inadequate way in which they were implemented. It's difficult to generalise. Certainly I've spoken with people who felt more safe and comfortable where they had been. That's hardly an argument for maintaining large institutions, but it is an argument for having a proper policy of transformation. You know, it was Enoch Powell that all those years ago who had said that was going to happen. And in many senses, you could say, although the nature and size of institutions has changed, institutionalisation, even if we're talking about institutionalisation in people's own homes, is still a really big and awful problem for many of us as mental health service users. One of the things I think that there was an inability to grapple with successfully with the formation of the post-war welfare state was people who needed longer term support. So actually what's said about people as mental health service users or people with learning difficulties equally applies at that time to many older people. So what actually happened was that the NHS started off on a road which meant eventually the care of older people, which remained in many cases institutional, was taken on by local authorities which were much less progressively centrally controlled. That changed bit by bit, but if we remember the kind of work done by people like Townsend, highlighting the difficulties facing mental health service users in the 1960s, of course what people like him were also finding out was the appalling neglect of older people in residential institutions and their abuse. And these, I think, are problems which people who went on to try and improve the welfare state, the evidence shows, have worked hard to change, because to begin with, the welfare state was very much paternalistic. It was a group of essentially white, privileged men thinking what would be good for people, and in many cases they got it right. They certainly got it righter with the NHS, but they didn't get it right with social care. They didn't get it right, I don't think, with mental health. And what I think is quite shocking, looking back on it as a mental health service user, is the unbelievable advances that we can see being made in physical health in our NHS. You know, where we read about babies being operated in within the womb. Unbelievable improvements, which we can read about on a daily basis, which is why people have such love of the NHS. But we must remember that the NHS is also about mental health services, and approaches to mental health in the NHS, some of them are no better or different to those being used in the 1950s. Some of the drugs that are still available and being used are actually the same drugs. The problem of people not getting the kind of humanistic support which we value the NHS for, the relationship-based support, the support which makes it possible for them to stay in their communities with their loved ones, for relationships to flourish. There is no such parity. The talks of parity, but it isn't like that in any serious way. I was involved still under the auspices of Survivors Speak Out, and then with some of the people from it, people like Gloria Gifford and Chris Harrison, both of whom were people who had mental health issues but also were disabled people. And I was very impressed by the strength of the disabled people's movement in the UK and internationally. And we forged links and we did things together with disabled people's organisations. There's always been a reticence amongst some mental health service users to identify with that other movement for all sorts of reasons. And in fact, we, as survivors, carried out 2 survivor-led projects exploring exactly that issue much more recently. And I think I think the disabled people's movement didn't always understand where survivors were coming from, that they didn't necessarily identify as disabled, and disability could seem like yet another negative on their identity. So there was that. But also I think that at that time there was perhaps a sense that what I think is the wonderful social model of disability could simply be transposed over to mental health service users. And I think there were a number of difficulties with that. I think people talked about one, they didn't really like necessarily being identified as disabled, as I've suggested. But also, one of the issues that would crop up is, if the social model of disability talks about impairment or perceived impairment, many survivors who had tried to rethink who they were and what was happening to them didn't necessarily see themselves as having an impairment. And so there were these reasons which you might see as either very profound and immovable, or not so much so, which I think got in the way. And I think survivors also had a strong feeling, many, that because essentially you are seen as damaged goods, not necessarily rational, potentially threatening, that you had to be very careful how you presented yourself and on what basis you campaigned. So to, as it were, deny that you were mentally ill could be seen as part of your personal and bigger problem of being an irrational person who wouldn't recognise the difficulties that you faced. And it's interesting that when the idea of mad pride emerged, which it did a good long time ago, and I think brought some really helpful developments into the arena of survivor struggles and activity. it never really was a mainstream survivor activity. You know, one of the issues I think is that mostly mental health service users over the years have really campaigned through traditional charities. And there have been times, for example, with Mind and Rethink, and what was then MACA and others, when that would make sense, because all of them tried to increase the amount of user involvement that they had and to be more receptive, so that Mind established something called MindLink, which was a survivor part of the organisation. But none of those mainstream charitable organisations ever departed from the fundamental mental illness model of mental health difficulties. And I think over the years, as the atmosphere, the political and policy atmosphere, has again got very much harsher in relation to mental health issues, I think they have been very wary about the amount of user involvement that they have that is effective. So we have seen organisations like Mind at national level, and I've been involved in Mind in the past and spoken at their conferences and so on and so forth, collaborate with government in issues which many survivors have felt was retrograde. For example, over their campaigns, the government campaigns to get people into employment, which a number of charities, including the ones I've mentioned, have participated in, which I think for survivors have felt very unhelpful. That kind of emphasis on us as mental health service users as being inherently risky, threatening, unreliable has persisted. And we know that while support services have reduced generally in recent years, the numbers of people who are receiving compulsory expressions of treatment, and of course we know that those are also racially biased and biased in other ways, has continued to increase. So that the proportions of people in more custodial situations and the proportions of people who are not voluntary patients have changed, and that's been associated also with developments like the idea of dual diagnosis.
And that's at a time when the British government is a signatory of the UNCRPD, which says that that shouldn't be happening.
Absolutely.
So it's a good area of hypocrisy of government, really, isn't it?
It's certainly a good area where what you appear to be signing up to is not reflected in what you are doing, and the extreme expression of that, I think, is to be found in the way that welfare reform affects mental health service users. Could I just say,
yes,
speaking from very close experience, that my partner works as a welfare rights worker, so you know, when she's coming back home, we talk about her experiences. A long time ago, I wanted to buy a second-hand bicycle, and I put an advert in a shop window, and somebody responded, and he'd been a relieving officer before the Second World War in the 1930s, and in London, and he told me that things in those days, they had what was then called the lunatic asylums and also the Metropolitan Asylum Board. And it was his responsibility as a relieving officer, which was the equivalent of a social worker, to go out when they had to bring someone into an asylum. And he told me, and I remember his words, he said, in those days people so dreaded the idea that their loved one would end up in an insane asylum that they would do everything to stop it happening. He said, by the time we would get there with their ambulance, sometimes people, quote, were raving. I remember this from many years ago. My partner has talked now of going to people's homes in a British city where there are people who cannot go out, where there are people who essentially are in their own room with aged parents who are getting no help, neither the parents nor the person with the mental health problem. And that is the life that they are leading. And you get the impression, it suddenly struck me, that where we were in the 1930s is actually what's happening to some families again now, where it's not just, as it might have been then, that people were so anxious not to have the stigma and awfulness of the psychiatric institution, but now the offer of any help is less and less likely to be there. We know that social work support, for example, has declined. We know that all sorts of support for adults with mental health and other problems has declined. Day centres, clubs, voluntary organisations, let alone the difficulties facing mental health service users' own organisations. I think what's happened in modern society is an increasing gulf between the understandings and ideology of formal politics and policy and ordinary human beings. Every year I go for my holiday near Great Yarmouth. We've done it for about 30 years, and every time I have that couple of weeks and I see the numbers of people who have learning difficulties, who are wheelchair users, the 3-generation families, all together having holidays, I think to myself, we owe that to the disabled people's movement, because in the old days, those people would have been kept in an institution or kept at home. It would have not been felt possible. Places would not have been accessible. You can go on a boat trip now and they make sure that there has to be access for a wheelchair, and there is a much more accessible culture. I think there is that same difficulty in relation to mental health issues. I do think the one way in which that slogan, which I've never been greatly convinced by, it happens to 1 in 4 of us, it means that how people behave to each other in families and in relationships, I think that has actually changed in relation to mental health issues. People do try, people do have more understanding, but how it works in policy and the impact of policy and politics on ordinary lives. I mean, we have had now for 3 years major anti-stigma policies and provisions for mental health service use, funded amongst others by central government, which never stops stigmatising mental health service users as people who are trying to get benefits without working and who are threatening. You can't have that kind of contradiction in a society without it doing serious damage. I think the problems of stigma, the main reasons why more social understandings are not accepted broadly as much as they could be, and I think they are more accepted than they were in the past, is because we have government, which is very powerful, which is pressing a very individualised model, and we have a psychiatric system which I think actually informally colludes with that, and of course we have an enormous pharmaceutical industry, which is one of the reasons why so much of the response to people with mental health problems, including the response I received, is one that's kind of a bit of a sledgehammer with drugs, rather than what we also know can be helpful, which is the more costly, more complex, which I was lucky to benefit from in my life, interventions of people with speaking therapies. And I don't just mean very crude stuff, I mean stuff done properly over time. CBT, which I've had benefit from, I have to say, can be useful. But if you do it in a very short, institutionalised way with semi-skilled workers, it has its limitations. And people, in research project I was involved in, people talk about it being long enough to highlight the problems they're facing and make them more kind of real and conscious for them, but not long enough to be able to help you deal with them. I would have to mention people like Mike Lawson, Peter Campbell and Louise Pembroke, and in a sort of a way I've always looked on Mike and Peter in a kind of similar breath, because I got to know them together. All of those 3 people, and also Chris Harrison, who sadly killed himself, were founder members of Survivors Speak Out. Chris, for example, who I told you was a disabled person, he was also involved actively in DAN, the organisation to challenge exclusions of people with physical and sensory impairments. Let me just say something about Louise Pembroke. I think Louise has an amazing contribution that she has made. What Louise did as a woman with those direct experiences in a non-medicalised way was to think through with others and to develop materials which helped us to see how issues known as, which we would now understand as self-harm, and what she called helpfully eating distress, had much more complex social relations, and that we had ways of understanding them which might be a lot more helpful than the traditional ways of understanding them, the ways in which they might be a response to serious problems that people were facing, of all kinds of abuse apart from anything else, of ways of trying to have some control and ways of then trying to help people negotiate them, first with least harm and then hopefully beyond that. And she produced, in Survivors Speak Out, fantastic resources which I know are still used or developed from and internationally, and a great achievement. And Peter, who had a central role in Survivors Speak Out, was somebody also who developed fresh thinking. I think one of the great things that we were part of was that movement which has persisted and grown enormously across health and social care, including all sorts of professions, of user involvement, user-led training and education. So that now, for example, and this has been the case since about 2002, any social work course, any professional social work course, undergraduate or graduate, qualifying or post-qualifying, has to have in it, running right through it, in every aspect of it, from recruitment right through to qualification, meaningful user and carer involvement, including mental health service users' involvement. And that's been, obviously it's sometimes challenged, but it's a wonderful development. And still, the other wonderful thing about it is that it has got central funding from government. We got started as a project, and we got started as a project when the then National Organisation for Social Work, the National Institute for Social Work, had this recognition in the late 20th century, 97, 98, 99, that all the talk now was of outcomes, and that we should measure policy and practice in terms of outcomes. But they realised that outcomes were mostly measured in terms of what professionals and managers thought, or policymakers. And so they set up a very small-scale project looking at what service user outcomes for support could be. And that was across social care support, but of course including mental health service users. Over the years we have carried out a number of user-controlled research projects to identify and develop the knowledge of people as service users rather than just sign up to professional or traditional research knowledge, learn how to carry out research in different ways, been influential in that, had links with government. We still have link with government in terms of feeding information to it, and it feeding information, us feeding information from the grassroots to it, and it feeding information about what it's trying to do for us to be able to comment on more broadly. And Shaping Our Lives has always been a network as well of user-led organisations, but also as those have come under attack of people as individual service users across the board. I think people like us and me see the effective future of challenging traditional approaches to mental health through such user-controlled organisations. We've had encouraging signs that there are people who have leading responsibilities in the Labour Party, for example, who have long recognised the invidious and cruel nature of welfare reform. I think we also know that there are people who are signed up and interested in different ways of understanding. So I'm very proud, for example, that when we launched in 2016 a book looking at the past of the welfare state, it's very much changed present and how it could have a more participatory future, that one of the keynote speakers there was John McDonnell, who showed a real understanding and a real determination to listen. There are lots of signs, I think, and I think if we were to have any kind of a coalition which included progressive elements from the Greens, from Labour and the Lib Dems, we can imagine that the kinds of participatory approaches that have long been signalled by movements of survivors and other movements, also which argue for equality, for resourcing, for our organisations and our activities, which highlight the importance of having such grassroots connections so that people can negotiate health and welfare systems more equally, more fairly, more inclusively, regardless of ethnicity, gender and sexuality and the rest. I think there will be hope. I don't see hope with the politics that we have, which are so divorced from ordinary people's experience, understanding and hopes for themselves, their loved ones facing difficulty and their children. One of the things I think that could be said about the difference between the disabled people's movement and the survivors movement, and I believe there have been both, and both have been strong, and both have largely been independent, but more working together, especially over welfare reform, is that the disabled people's movement, right from early on, from the middle 70s, worked out its own philosophy based on a social model of disability and based also on this idea of independent living, that you should have the support to be able to live as independently as other people can who are not disabled. There's always been a hole in the middle, I think, for survivors, for one reason or another. In terms of, we've always had our principles. I don't think we've had anything like as clear a philosophy. What's interesting about Mad Studies is it does have a philosophy. This is a kind of a development. It calls itself Mad Studies, but it's always been about action as well as finding out. It's an intellectual, but it's just like the Disabled People's Movement, an intellectual, but also a practice and life-based approach. And it started in Canada with early developments in Scotland. It's really been picked up in the last few years since the publication of a major book by survivors called Mad Matters. It is an initiative led by survivors, but drawing in others of like mind. Crucially, it rejects a biomedical model. It is much more committed to a social understanding of distress. It challenges traditional assumptions about the relationship of madness and distress, its pathological relationship with the individual, and seeks to explore much broader and meaningful social relations. I think it fills that gap which, in my opinion, has sometimes been a difficulty for the survivor movement, and one of the reasons that people like me have always wanted to build new understandings and relationships with the disabled people's movement. You have to have a philosophy. You can't kind of pretend that you're sort of not signed up but are signed up to a biomedical model. And I think Mad Studies, which has gained a real interest internationally, may help us with that. What it's still got to do is it's got to, like all movements that maybe have Western origins, the Disabled People's Movement, it's got to engage on equal terms and make their involvement as determined and innovative as any other involvement. The Global South, it's got to involve indigenous groups, populations, as has been the case. We've learned very much about in the Canadian experience. You've got to do that. And it, of course, has to involve those groups that have fared particularly badly under traditional psychiatric provision, some black communities and ethnic minority communities. As well as, I think we should add, LGBTQ groups. One of the things I would stress here is that we must approach any engagement that we seek to have with the Global South on as equal terms as we can, and that's easier said than done. Just talking nationally, one of the things that the Department of Health funded Shaping Our Lives to do was a major 4-year research and development project called Beyond the Usual Suspects, where we, resourcing local user-led organisations, wanted to find out what was keeping some groups out of being involved in participatory schemes and action, and how could that be challenged. And what was fascinating was the even wider breadth of exclusions that operate even beyond those taken into account by the equalities legislation. And I can elaborate on that if you'd like me to. But so these also operate in the South, and there are elites all over the world, and there are barriers all over the world, and that's the big struggle that we all of us face. One of the things I have learned, however, is that the usefulness of United Nations, the UN, I never get the initials the right way around.
UNCRPD.
Yeah, for example, in the Global South, as a lever to be used, which can be used in a number of Global South countries more effectively, and it's a sad thing to have to say, than can be used in countries like the UK. Very important.
Well, I've just come back from the UN where we had the 12th Conference of State Parties. It's 12 years since the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability was introduced. 178 countries, which is the vast majority, 95% of the world's population, come under this. But we don't really see very much change. It was a statement of intent, but how you change the statement of intent into implementation is an issue. And do you think if we could have more coming together of the two groups that are covered by that, people with mental health issues and those who are seen as physically or mentally disabled, coming together would give us greater strength to force governments to implement it.
Of course it would. It's very difficult for us to come together. Not that long ago, this government managed to be the holder of a global conference on mental health. And what was significant about that was that it was organised without the equal involvement of user-led organisations. And those of us seen as perhaps not reflecting the dominant agenda of government were not encouraged to come. We were able in a very short time to sign up and get support to challenge that event and to show its limited credibility globally and nationally across different groups, including disabled people and mental health service users. It has to be alliance, and we have to be imaginative about alliances and try and build alliances with equality. All of these things are easier said than done, and all of them at some point require some kind of external resourcing, which we so often lack. The welfare reforms have been utterly destabilising of people as survivors.